Well, hey, One Life. My name's Ryan, and I'm the pastor of one of our churches that's in Henderson, Kentucky, and it is great to be with you today. Just a couple things off the top that I want to make sure that you know. Number one, I've been around here for a while, and so really cool to see kind of where things have been and where they've been going, and COVID's been crazy, and it's been a lot. But a little bit more importantly, today, I get to kind of preach and teach, and it's one of the things that I really feel like I'm wired to do and I enjoy doing, but I also have a very specific way that I approach it. See, like I don't approach this as if I'm some expert that's here to give you a lot of things to learn and do from me. See, I kind of view us as these co-learners that are together trying to figure this thing out. Maybe you're trying to figure out your walk as a Christian or a follower of Jesus, or maybe you're trying to figure out what you believe in general. And I believe very, very, very sincerely that we're in this thing together, navigating these things together. And so it's really important. I just like to get that out there first and foremost so that you know and you're aware, and then we'll get to moving on. But I'm honored to be in this series, Inside Out, because being real, especially around the world, is something that I don't believe the church has been really gifted at over the last several years, at least in my lifetime and beyond. I don't believe we've been great at it. I believe we've been really good at telling people they need to kind of get cleaned up and do certain things, but I don't know that we've been really great. And I'm excited to talk a little bit about what Jesus has to say about this whole thing, because I believe very much that transparency is a key thing in our culture, but also a key thing for you and I as we're trying to figure this out, as we're trying to thrive in a world that seems to be filled with challenges. Now, my dad was a contractor, so that means a couple things. If you had a family member that owned any kind of construction company, you know where I'm at. Like, we live on job sites. We lived at houses, whether we were remodeling or whether we were building brand new ones. I was there from the day, or as far as I can remember, I was with my dad working and building houses. So I'm pretty well versed in the home building process. Not a genius by any means, but I kind of know what's going on. And there's one time, particularly, I think I was 22 years old, and we were kind of in the process of building the house. We had got the floor done, we got the walls all up. We even had a company come in and put the trusses down, that makes up the shape of a roof, and we were ready to put the decking on. So that means that the trusses were set, everything was braced up and ready to go, and we could put this flat part on the top of the roof that your roofing nails to. And so we're doing that, and I'm young, so it was no big deal. We had a couple of us up there, and we were doing our thing, and we brought one piece up, and we laid it down, and then somebody put a nail in it, and then we looked up, and I realized one important thing, that the air hose that was using our nail gun, firing our nail gun, was underneath the board that we just laid, and somebody had nailed it. So that meant really one thing, because my dad was the boss, and I was kind of the boss's kid, kind of what it is. I got to go under there and pull it loose. So here's what I did. I looked down, and there was a piece of bracing underneath the piece of wood, so I stepped on that piece of bracing, and I get down, and I'm pulling the air hose through, and I'm pulling it through for about 3 or 4 seconds, when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, that board goes out from under me. And I proceed to fall about 10 or 11 feet, and thank goodness there was a ladder to catch me about right here, so that I hit the top corner of the ladder and slid down, and I landed on my feet. And really, the only thing that happened to me that day was that I had 3 cracked ribs, and my dad was like, no, it's gonna hurt worse tomorrow, so I'm gonna need you to finish the day, right? That would be like child abuse and neglect today. I'm such a victim, right? But no, that's what we did. So that day we finished it, and we moved on. Now, why do I tell you that story? Here's what. That piece of wood that I put my foot on was a 2x4. And that 2x4 was only spanning the width of about 2 feet. So that means that if I take that 2x4 and set it on 2 chairs or whatever, I could put 10 times my weight on that board and it's not gonna break. However, that board was nailed on the bottom side of the wood, and I was standing from the top. So the reason that wood fell was because I tried to utilize the wood to do something it was never intended to be done. It was perfectly installed. It was holding what it was meant to be held. It did everything that it was supposed to do until I stepped on it from the wrong position, and I put it in a position that it was never intended to be put in, and therefore it failed, and I wound up with 3 cracked ribs and on the couch for 2 weeks. Now, last week, Brett started out this story, kind of in my Bible, they titled the section the 6 woes. So Jesus gives 3 of these woes to these Pharisees, right? So these Pharisees were really, really good. They were highly religious guys. They were really gifted. Really, they were celebrities in the ancient world. And Brett talked about that last week. Highly recommend, if you didn't catch that, to go back and find it. But they were kind of celebrities in the ancient world, especially in the Jewish world. And so they were really gifted at obeying the law. So God had set these laws in order in place and taught his people how they can live in the presence of God. And they came with all these laws. And these Pharisees were exquisite at it. So much so that when Jesus came and was doing all these things, it was pushing the paradigm of how they did things, it really caused some intense friction. Like Jesus was really kind of hard on these dudes, right? Like one example was this tithing is a principle in our faith as followers of Jesus, or even in the Old Testament, you can see it talks about a tithing, a tenth. And so they would literally go and get the tenths, and Brett talked about all that, but they were really good at it. But Jesus was not real happy with them because they would do those things over social justice things, over pursuing the marginalized, over the people, and Jesus was calling them out on it. And before we kind of start on this second half of this passage, which is a completely different but similar sect of people, of leaders in the church, or in the Jewish religion of that day that Jesus stepped into, I want us to make sure we understand that Jesus is not super thrilled. Like, I don't think he's angry where he's flipping tables and being disrespectful, but I do think he's towing the line of aggression with these men. And it makes me ask the question, why? Like, I love to ask that question. I like to ask lots of questions when I read the Bible, by the way. And that's really how I shape sermons. I figure out what questions I have, and I try to go answer the questions. So one of the questions that I initially had was, why is he really so bent? I know why he's bent up about it, but why is he really, really bent out of shape about it? And if we look back in Luke chapter 4, here's what we see when Jesus, and I got to preach this message about a year ago, and we get to see kind of Jesus' own opinion of his purpose or his mission here. And he says it this way. He says, the Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to do a couple things. Here they are. To proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. A couple things about that. Number one, he said he came to proclaim good news to the poor. Now in the Old Testament, that's a quote from Isaiah 61, right? And in the Old Testament, that phrase, the poor, is a little bit more robust than just, people of a lower socioeconomic class. It really encompasses an entire, several different groups of people. It could be low socioeconomic class, but it could also be somebody who might be high class in socioeconomics, but it might be somebody who's poor in spirit. Like, let's look at Matthew, for example, who was a tax collector. I'm pretty sure that he wasn't hurting for money, right? He dealt in money. It's what he did. He was most likely financially okay, but he was poor in spirit because he was an outcast and he was marginalized. This would include people that make series of bad decisions throughout their entire life that leave them in a place to where they're marginal, and they're in the margins and they're outcasts. So the poor is much more of a mindset, or the poor in spirit, than it is just simply impoverished human beings. So that's one. He came to profess good news, to proclaim good news to the poor. And then he talks about bringing freedom to captives. And at the end, he brings up even this year that he references a specific year. Now, this concept is bigger than I really have time for, but I think it's important to understand as far as how Jesus sees himself. You see, in the Old Testament, it set up this thing called the Year of Jubilee. And every 7 years or so, God's people would kind of be reinstated back to an original place. So what that means is if you had taken and squandered all of your family's inheritance, you had squandered everything, every so often there would be this Year of Jubilee that would be celebrated, that you could go maybe be from being an actual slave in servitude to being free. You could go from not having any land to having land. So Jesus' mission, like kind of the way I want to say it today, is that Jesus' mission was to come, and how he said it, was to build this kingdom that was completely opposite of everything else that anybody in life was experiencing. Everything. And that rattled some serious cages. But Jesus, his relationship with the Father, all in all, at the end of the day, his relationship with God, his faith in God, his understanding of who God is, was a benefit to everybody that he came into contact with. So the overarching concept, the overarching thing I want us to look at today is that for us as followers of Jesus, our faith in God, our relationship with the Father, our relationship with Jesus is meant, it's designed from the very beginning of everything to impact other people, to build up other people, to encourage other people. That's the point. And you may be watching this and maybe you've had a terrible experience with church. Maybe you've had a terrible experience with church people. I need to apologize to you for that because that's never been the intention. Everything that we are is intended to benefit other people, to encourage other people. Jesus says, he says, I came to give life and life abundantly. That wasn't to himself. It was to others. Outside impact. So your faith as a follower of Jesus is intended from the very beginning of time to impact other people. And if you haven't experienced that, or maybe you're a person of faith that has used your faith to not do that. I want to talk through that, the implications of what Jesus is talking about. So I'm going to read through the passage, and I'll pause here and there in a couple of places, and I want to talk through what Jesus is getting after and what these lawyers, they're not Pharisees, they're lawyers, kind of what they are perceiving that Jesus is saying, or maybe even what Jesus wants them to hear. So we are in Luke chapter 11, and we're going to pick it up starting in verse 45. Here we go. One of the experts in the law answered him, Teacher, when you say these things, you insult us also. And Jesus replied, and you experts in the law, woe to you because you load people down with burdens they can hardly carry, and you yourselves will not lift a finger to help them. Okay, so lawyers and Pharisees are a little bit different people. Now I want you to think, you could think like a professor of theology at a seminary or a university versus kind of what I'm doing now, just a local pastor. They can be one and the same, but they're not always that way. You could even think like a PhD versus an MD or a medical doctor. One's kind of doing research and stuff like that, and the other's much more practical in what's going on. Now, it's important that we understand the point of the lawyer, though. Like, why do they exist and what do they do? And I don't know that I ever knew this before, but they're essentially, their job to get it into one sentence would be to increase the knowledge of the law and the ability to follow it. To increase the knowledge of the law and to help people follow it. So here's kind of what they would do as an example. They would let's just take the Sabbath. So Sabbath, rest, kind of is another way to think about that. We're not going to do a teaching on that right now. But Sabbath is essentially rest. Let's take some time and honor God with our rest. We're going to honor him with our work, and we're going to take a day and not work, modeling after him. So what a scribe would do is like, okay, so God's told us to rest in this commandment. So what we're going to do is we're going to define what that means. So we're going to take and we're going to say, okay, so if on the Sabbath for a Jew, you can walk this many steps or you can walk this distance. You know, maybe in the modern day, maybe we'd have to like fold all of our toilet paper the day before, right? You have to, if you're going to cook, there's only certain ways that you can go about heating things up because maybe you couldn't make a fire. Maybe you couldn't do those things. And you talk about if you need to go get some water for that day, how are you preparing on the front side to make all that happen? If you can only do so many steps and you can only do so many things when it comes to preparing meals and to preparing all that stuff, then there's only so many things that you can do without violating the law. And Brett last week mentioned this. It was important that they not violate the law because historically speaking, they violated the law and they would end up in this foreign country as prisoners for 400 years. So their main principle and goal of their job and their existence is to make the law followable. But it's a lot like, you know, the people that write the instruction books for putting together furniture that you buy in a box. I remember Cynthia and she bought a Kmart bedroom suit our first year of marriage, and it took me and my dad like 8 hours to put that stupid thing together. It was a lot of things, but helpful was not one of them. Right? Like the person who wrote that instruction book was not very helpful to me and my dad who were trying to put this thing together and make it happen. So in their attempt to make things more clear and understandable, Jesus is accusing them of making everybody's lives harder. And in my preparation time, I've grown to empathize with these lawyers a little bit. I think they get a bad rap. Because I know beyond a shadow of a doubt, being kind of a member of the clergy or being a pastor or doing this vocationally as what I do for a living, I know my heart, and I know that I want to help, and I can't help but think that that's their heart, that that's what they're thinking. But there's some level of blindness to it. And so maybe as a lawyer, what they've done is taken Sabbath and they've built all these boundaries to guarantee that, okay, we're not gonna violate Sabbath, and if we don't fold too much toilet paper or we don't walk too far or we don't heal people, then we're guaranteed we're not gonna break this law. So then therefore that guarantees that we're not gonna end up in slavery again. Like I get the mentality, I get where they're coming from. But we can't forget Jesus and why he's such at odds with that. At the core of everything that he is, he tells us that the Holy Spirit has anointed him to do a couple things. Proclaim good news to the poor, to heal the blind, to heal the sick. And he didn't say anything about us obeying laws, about him. He didn't come to ensure that people obey laws. He didn't do that. He came to ensure that the people were valued. And last week we looked at the Pharisees and how they violated it. And this week we look at the lawyers and look how they violated it. And Jesus is saying, listen, the way that you're focusing everything on the laws, you're setting up all these fences that you think that you're doing some help, but all you're doing is creating more complex situations for my people that I've come to save, that I've come to love and cherish in my life. You're making it more complex. And not only that, you're not doing anything to help them out. That guy that wrote that instruction booklet for me and my dad to put that bedroom suit together never showed up to help me do anything. And Jesus is saying you misplaced your priority when it comes to the law. The law is good. The law is beautiful. It's how we do it. But all the things that you're placing around it are doing nothing but making everything hard for everybody else. Have you experienced that? Like in your church experience, have you experienced people just shaming you and belittling you for all the things that you don't do? Are you the person that does that? Like the second that you find out that there's something going on in somebody's life, are you the one that wants to just go hammer them and let them know that what's going on is not as bad and it's got to stop, as opposed to saying, listen, here's where we're at. How can I love you through this? How can we move forward? How can you add value to somebody instead of piling up their responsibility or piling up their judgment that they're going to experience? Jesus is saying the law is beautiful. But when you take the law and you replace the law or replace the people, the value of God's creation with the law, with the commandment that was created, you're getting things out of order. You can't do that. And as much as I can empathize with the lawyers from both sides, I mean, I have those thoughts. Like if you're a follower of Jesus, you're gonna have, if somebody else claims to be a follower of Jesus, and I see them doing something that goes against that claim, there are natural judgments that go in my heart that I have to pray and process through. They're just there. We can't necessarily help that, but what we can help is where we take those thoughts, where we place the value, and are we pursuing the hearts of the marginalized, or are we just telling them all the things that they have to do or stop doing in order to be loved by God? And he says it this way, the next passage, starting in 47. This is the second woe. He says it this. He says, woe to you because you build tombs for the prophets, and it was your forefathers who killed them. So you testify that you approve of what your forefathers did. They killed the prophets, and you build their tombs. Because of this, God, in his wisdom, said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will kill, and others they will persecute. Therefore, this generation will be held responsible for the blood of all the prophets that has been shed since the beginning of the world, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, who was killed between the altar and the sanctuary. Yes, I tell you, this generation will be held responsible for it all. Okay, so here's the thing. The very first woe, Jesus knows I came to give life and life abundant. I came to proclaim good news to the marginalized, set prisoners free. Woe to you for making things more complex when I've come to make them whole. And then he goes on and says, essentially, you're acting just like your forefathers that killed all the prophets. In fact, what they were doing in this time in life was they were building monuments. They were building statues and tombs for these prophets because there was like this blood guilt for what was happening and what their ancestors had done that they were trying to make right. And Jesus is pointing out a very real thing in their life that they were observing. Some of them were probably funding or helping make happen. And he takes this reality and he says, listen, here's the thing. What you're trying to do these things to make amends, but what you're doing is the same thing. It just looks a little bit different. Because what God did was he took these prophets and he started like this. He said, I'm gonna send my mouthpiece. I'm gonna send my voice through these men. I'm gonna send my voice to these people, men and women, and we're gonna say things that are from God directly, that are gonna be meaningful and that are gonna matter. And what your ancestors did was kill them. They eliminated my ability or my chosen way, not his ability. They eliminated his chosen way to speak to his people through other people. And what he's saying is that by doing this stuff and by trying to shut me down and by trying to have me stoned and all these things, you're doing the exact same thing as your forefathers did. You're doing the exact same thing. It's not any different. That would have blown their minds. Can you imagine? Like historically, if your family had some sort of stain on the family and everything that you're doing to try to make that right, and then this guy comes along here making all these crazy claims, telling you that you're just like your ancestors who you probably don't respect as much as you should because of what they did. You're making people's lives more complex. You're creating burdens, and then you're not helping them carry it. You're essentially doing the exact same thing that your forefathers did. And then the third woe is probably the most hard-hitting of all of them. Verse 52 says, woe to you, experts in the law, because you have taken away the key to knowledge. You yourselves have not entered, and you have hindered those who were entering. Now here's the point. I want to remind you, the entire existence of a lawyer would have been to increase knowledge, awareness, and practical ability to know and keep the law. That would have been the point of their existence. All of their hard-earned research. These are men that would have known probably most words in the entire first 5 books of the Bible. Have you ever tried to memorize anything in Exodus after the first half? It's incredibly hard, right? It's difficult. These guys would have had it memorized. They would have known it like the back of their hand. At least they would have had Leviticus memorized. That's where the law was. These would have been experts that would have been called in to legal issues concerning the law. They would have been called in to make judgments according to the law. And Jesus, out of nowhere, says, listen, no. What you've done is you don't even have the key to knowledge. You've missed it. And because you missed it, you're hindering other people's ability to step into what the kingdom is that I'm trying to build on this earth, also known as your faith in God is not helping anybody else anymore. The faith that you have, it seems to be only helping you or trying to help everybody in the wrong ways. Creating burdens and not helping people carry them. That's exactly what your forefathers have done. They missed the boat and you're missing the boat even though you think that you're not. And as a result of those two things, you don't have the key of knowledge to the kingdom that I'm trying to build, and you're hindering other people from having the same knowledge and the same experience. And at the end of the day, it's because their faith was not for other people. Their faith was not for encouraging other people and loving other people and serving other people. It was all around how do we obey this law to the best point that we can so that we are loved more. And Jesus is essentially saying, I'm not calling you to not go to exile. I am calling you to freedom. I've been sent here. I've been anointed by the Holy Spirit that not to come here and keep you from exile. I've been anointed to come and give you freedom. Like, did you understand the difference? Like, it's kind of like when you play in a sport. I don't play to not lose. Like, I'm not gonna do just the very minimal not to lose. I'm gonna do everything that I can to get the win. And that's what he said. You're not here to not go back to exile for 400 years. Yes, I know exile was terrible. It was awful. It was miserable. There were some terrible things that happened. But at the end of the day, I've called you to freedom, even if it's in the midst of exile. He came to proclaim freedom for the captives. And these men were missing the boat, and they had every single opportunity to get it all right. Now, when we read these passages, guys, here's what we do. When people that study and read the Bible, our tendency is this. We love to read ourselves into the story like we're the victim, or we're the person that's being healed, right? Or we're the broken person by the gate. But if you claim to be a follower of Jesus and you're a person that pursues that in life, I think we can identify more with the Pharisees and the lawyers, right? Think about it. How many experiences have you had in a church context that just are so wrought with hypocrisy that you can't stand it? I'm born and raised in church. I walked away from the church for 4 years because of what I felt was blatant hypocrisy. Because what I observed was the exact opposite of the claim that I would go to that place and I would hear every single Sunday. And I'm not saying people are bad in general because of that. I'm saying we've been invited to get this thing right. And we've been invited to build and develop this relationship with God through Jesus. We've been invited to step into that and learn and be learners of his nature and character through his word. And we can spend time with him. The creator of the universe opened up this avenue of prayer that we can spend time with him and we can know more about him. He can speak to us in wild ways through those moments. I don't even know how that really works necessarily, but I know it's real and I know it's true. And what we tend to do is we boil down this beauty, this beautiful story of forgiveness and hope and mercy and this God that lovingly pursues our hearts, and we boil it down to simply whether we say cuss words or we don't, or whether we consume any alcohol or not, or we don't. And we boil it down to what you have to do as a practice and what you can't do. And so we're all wrapped up in the law, and we're wrapped up on not going back to exile instead of walking in the freedom that God's called us to. And when we do that, when we fail to walk in that freedom, that's when the hypocrisy creeps in, because we can't help but make audacious claims that could never be true. We can't help it. Like, we can't help but walk in and just pretend everything's okay all the time. Hey guys, I'm great. How are you today? Oh, I'm fine, I'm great. Life's great. There's a train wreck all week long and it's been awful. It's like the epitome of hell on earth, but I'm great. Just walking in freedom. And you guys haven't had my Kentucky accent much, but you just got some, I believe. You need a little bit of Kentucky in your life, right? So I know I'm getting heavy, but the point is the point. Because as the church, we're also not fighting to not be hypocrites. We're fighting to be real, to be transparent, to walk out our faith on a daily basis in a way that honors the Lord. That's the goal, that's the claim, if you call yourself a follower of Jesus. And then when we violate that claim, which happens all the time, then we own it and we step into it and we say, listen, thank God for Jesus. Because without it, I'd have to sit back in this miserable failure knowing I'll never add up, because I can never do the law the way that I think I should be able to execute the law. I can never obey enough. I can never be good enough. I can never not cuss enough. I can never love my spouse enough. I can never read my Bible enough. I can never raise my hands in church enough. So as we're pursuing living out authenticity, that's that value that Brett brought up last week. Authenticity, it's authentic and integrity meshed together, right? You can be authentically you, right? And have integrity about it. That's who God's called you to be. And as we're walking that out, here's the important part of that. Here's one important part of that. We need to stop fighting for moral high ground. These lawyers, they would create all these systems. They would create all these things that we had to do to not break this law. And what it turns into, and it becomes, and this happens for me too, is that the more that I can read my Bible and the more knowledgeable I can become about the Bible and the more that I stand in hand and raise my hands and operate out of my spiritual gifts, then it seems like we step up into these tiers and we tend to raise it and get elevated into this higher level of spiritual maturity. And we know God. Like, because I'm a pastor, like, it seems like I should have some special telephone that I can call and talk to God, and then he can direct us all. And then we get these pedestals built up. Well, you're amazing. Well, she's the best worship leader I've ever seen. Well, he's the best preacher I've ever had. Well, they're my favorite person to talk to and go get counseling from, and all this stuff, and it builds up. And so then we start looking around and saying, well, man, like, I'm better than they are. Like, at the end of the day, I don't wrestle with the same sins that they wrestle with. And we fight for moral high ground and we don't even know it. Walking in thought integrity is understanding that Jesus is the only person that's ever been able to even claim to have moral high ground, much less walk it out. We got to stop fighting for moral high ground. It's got to go away. And the last thing I want to leave you with is we have to stop comparing ourselves to other people. As a follower of Jesus, our comparison has to be to him. Because I will always be able to find people that I can behave better than. I will always be able to find people that I know more about the Bible than. I will always be able to find people that sin more than I do. But I will never find that in Jesus. And it's not meant to demean me in any way. It's meant to say Jesus is perfect. He is worthy. He is everything that I strive to be and more. And I'm going to pursue that with everything that I have, knowing that when I fail, when my flesh fails me, that I can step into the forgiveness that he offered me a long time ago. And my friends, if you're not a follower of Jesus, that's what you're invited to. You're not invited to come to be this pious, moral bigot that just makes everybody else feel like trash all the time. You're called and invited into a relationship that's loving, that's beautiful, that's holy, that will never let you down, despite all the ways your flesh, your body, your life will try to convince you that it will. Let's not allow fallen leaders that we've put up on those pedestals to dictate why or if we believe in God or the level of our faith and walk in God. And let's be people as followers of Jesus. If you're not a follower of Jesus, I invite you to step into that. Let's be people to where our faith is lived out so authentically that people can't help but know more about Jesus because of our journey.